Rod doing Rod. Thank you for joining me. So, you hip hop fans, I have a question for you. How many albums does Biggie have? I'm going to give you a couple of seconds to answer that question. Okay, I believe you are wrong. So I'm not being condescending, but I'm pretty sure you said 2. You probably said Ready to Die and Life After Death. Or maybe you said 3 because you added Born Again to that. Or maybe you said 4 because you added Biggie duets to that. Well, all of those answers are wrong. The answer is at least 5. Okay. Now, why is this important? We're 50 years on in hip hop, right? Somewhere around there. And when we're judging Biggie's legacy or any rapper who is up for the GOAT status or anything like that, we look at how many albums they have, how many classic albums they have, how long were they out, how long was their influence. And with Biggie, as time goes on, you hear more and more people say, well, he only released 2 albums and he was only out like 5 years. So people are starting to disqualify him a little from that GOAT conversation. I know no one who's actually knowledgeable and who was there, but you're starting to hear people say that. And it holds a little bit of water because, yeah, he was only out a few years. And as great as he was, how much influence could he have had in those few years? The answer is a lot. But at least it's an argument I can listen to if made well, if well articulated. So, but the thing is, that argument is mostly, it's made on a false premise, on the premise that he only released 2 albums. Now, there's the whole, how many albums does Biggie have and how many albums did Biggie release? We know when we talk about the duets and the Born Again, and I don't even remember, I'm pretty sure there was nothing else released under Notorious B.i.g. That those are in his discography and in his catalog, but they were posthumous. So we know they were released after he died. He didn't record those albums to be released. So I'm talking about music that Biggie recorded and gave to you, okay, intended for you to hear from him. And I'm saying at least 5 albums. All right, so let me explain that. We have his debut album, right? Of course, Ready to Die. One of the most influential albums ever. Clean sounding, had a lot of street songs, had a lot of pop songs on them, or at least a couple of pop songs. Took that whole Tupac blueprint. Well, it was actually the LL Cool J blueprint of songs for the dudes, songs for the chicks. But it had that, definitely had that Tupac influence, had that Chronic influence to it. And of course, that album, 4 million copies. We know what was on it. Big Papa, the original One More Chance. What else we had on there? Warning, The What with Meth, and of course, Juicy, right? So that's one album. Second album, Life After Death, okay? Now, he was alive to create this album. He was alive when the first single dropped. He did the video for Hypnotize. And that album, of course, is a landmark album. It was the second double album. Well, I don't know. Actually, I'm pretty sure All Eyes on Me wasn't the first hip hop double album. If I remember correctly, I remember there was something a little less popular that was released around that a few years before, maybe even around that time. But as far as most people know, All Eyes on Me was the first really important hip hop double album, and Life After Death was the second. So, of course, that album went diamond, one of the few hip hop diamond albums ever, meaning it sold 10 million plus copies domestically in the US. And of course, that album spawned many, many hits. 5 mics in the source. Everybody, it seems like even if you don't know hip hop, you know a song from that album. Very, very important album. Life After Death, his second album. Everyone can agree with me on that. Now, what was his third album? Life After Death, right? So, like I said, it was a double album. but it was 2 albums. He may not have intended for it to be 2 albums, but apparently the story was he was in the hospital because of the car crash, and he was just recording more music, so he ended up adding more songs to the album, if I'm remembering that story right. And why do I say it's 2 albums? Well, the recording industry of America agrees, right? Because when that album was sold, or when double albums are sold, they count for 2, which is one of the reasons it sold so many copies. And if you remember buying it at the time, if you're old enough, you paid like there were 2 albums, right? It was over $20 at the time. So, but that's not the only reason why I say it counts for 2 albums. Some artists who have a lot of songs on one project, whether it's a double album or it's one album with a lot of songs, they just have a lot of songs on an album. But Life After Death, conceptually, you can split it into 2 albums in many different ways. You can split it into a pop album and a more street album if you want, where you have your Hypnotizes and More Money, More Problems and songs like that on the pop album, and Nasty Boy and stuff like that. I Love the Dough. And then you can make it a more street album with your your What's Beef and Somebody Got to Die and records like that, right? And the joint with the Locks, Last Days, so you can do that. You can chop that album up into 2 different albums and say one is more of a classic New York kind of sounding album, and one is more of a kind of bring everybody together by making it sound more national, more like you had the Southern kind of sound, the West Coast, the Midwest and everything. So you can say one album had songs like the joint RZA produced, what was it? Long Kiss Goodnight. And it had 10 Crack Commandments and Kick in the Door, right? Really, really New York. And then the other album had joints like the Bone and Biggie joint, Notorious Thugs, right? Midwest. Went to the South and got who you got from the South? My bad. I'm confusing right there. I'm thinking of something else. Sorry. West Coast, where you got Too Short, right? And then going back to Cali with that sound. Why am I feeling like he did something with a Southerner that I'm not thinking of right now? I could have that wrong. But anyway, even kind of a Southern bounce on certain joints, The What's Beef kind of had that Southern bounce kind of to it a little bit, right? And so you could have done it that way. You could have done it so I said you could have done it as more of like a New York and then like a out of New York kind of record, a commercial and a like a pop and then a more hardcore record. And you could have done it as something that was sort of a continuation, more closer conceptually to Ready to Die. When you think of like how the album starts, with Somebody Gotta Die and like Niggas Bleed, and like those sound a little more conceptually like Ready to Die, almost like a Ready to Die 2. And then you could hear his evolution with his songwriting and the style of his lyrics on some of the other songs, like Another, with Little Kim, or My Downfall, some of these other songs. So I think that should count for 2 albums. It does count for 2 albums, So we up to 3 albums, right? Ready to Die, Life After Death, Life After Death. What's the 4th album? 4th album is Junior Mafia. So we know that Biggie wrote most of the Junior Mafia album. And he didn't write all of it because obviously like Klepto, you guys don't care about this stuff. You probably don't remember most of these people, but one of the rappers on there, Klepto, he was actually a pretty good rapper. I think he was the second best rapper in the group, which is not saying all that much, sorry, but he was a good rapper. And obviously Biggie didn't write his lyrics, like he was an actual rapper. And maybe some of those other verses, I can't really imagine Biggie wrote some of those other verses like Delvec and all those guys. just because of how they sounded. They didn't sound up to Biggie's quality, unless Biggie was just like, these are throwaways. I just need to get this verse written. I already got the beat. I got Kim on it. I got, I'm on it or whatever. So, and he just wrote those real quick and just gave them to those guys. But I don't think he wrote that. But he definitely wrote Lil Kim's verses. He definitely wrote Lil C's verses. And then he was on certain songs, or his hook was on certain songs, so he was like, he wrote it. He masterminded it. He recorded a lot of it, and you could imagine he did all those reference tracks as well. So he basically did a whole album, and he gave it to you, but he put it under Junior Mafia to put his crew on. So for me, that's album number 4. Album number 5, for very similar reasons, Lil Kim's debut album. We know he wrote all of that. I'm sure you heard that reference track, or maybe you haven't, for the Queen Bitch song. And hearing that, you realize, you're like, yeah, like Biggie did this a lot of times for most of her songs. You just hear him rapping over it and doing everything, and that's how I kind of came to this topic, because I was like, when you listen to a lot of the old Lil Kim and you think about it and you're like, man, Biggie was writing that. Like sometimes she'd refer to him, and it's like he was referring to himself, and he would write from the female perspective too. And he was writing it because if you knew his style, you just heard it all in what Kim was doing. And to think about the fact that like he was writing from that perspective, it was another album. It was a successful album, yeah, because of the production and everything, but you felt his vibe all through it, and he was writing it and he was referencing it. So it was basically him again writing an album and saying, here you go. And he's giving it to you while he's alive. So that for me is the 5th album. So we have Ready to Die, Life After Death, Life After Death, the Junior Mafia debut album, still the only Junior Mafia album, right? And Lil Kim's debut album. That's 5 albums that need to be considered when you're saying he's not the GOAT, or he is the GOAT, or he should be considered on that Mount Rushmore with people who have a larger catalog. So now I say at least 5, because if you want to then say, okay, now remember, I didn't count that mid album, Born Again. I mean, we did, that wasn't a Biggie album, but we heard a lot of those songs, almost everything on there in other contexts. And for me, it almost constitutes a whole other album when you think of the amount of songs. I mean, actual songs like Who Shot Ya, what's the other one that he ended, Dead Wrong, stuff like that you heard that may have been on soundtracks or mixtapes and stuff like that. And then so many features, wild amount of features with Luke. Maybe that's why I was thinking of a Southern joint. I was thinking of Luke. People like Luke and Crustified Dibs and Sadat X, and I mean so many damn features that Biggie did. You could put together a really solid album, and it wouldn't just sound like a mixtape thrown together like Best of Biggie. It would, the joints he did on the Bad Boys mixtapes, it would sound like an album of features, but you could put it and make it kind of cohesive and sound like an album. And you could just pick the best ones, right? You can compile them all and make a dope mixtape. But if you pick the best ones and you really curated it well, which is what they didn't do with Born Again, you can get another album out of that. You can get another decent album out of that. So if you're trying to like determine this guy's legacy, I think you should consider that and say, well, he didn't just sprinkle some dope verses here or there. He really put together another album's worth of material, at least one, but I'm just going to say one. That's why I'm going to say at least 5, because you could say a 6th. And he was executive producer of Diddy's debut album as well. And I mean, he really anchored Victory. So when you think of a song like Victory, that could have been on another Biggie album. That sounds like a Biggie song. And that also props up my argument that you really are talking about at least 5 albums, probably another album or two worth of music where you can kind of make another, conceptually another Biggie album. So for me, when I'm making the argument about Biggie being so influential, one of the best of all time, and people say, well, he didn't do what Tupac did. He didn't influence like Tupac did. And yeah, that's true, or you can say it's true as far as like socially, rappers trying to sound like him and people still just imitating him and just living for him, like or Jada Pinkett memes and stuff. But when you look at what he did in that short amount of time, and the thing is, as far as influence, it was hard because you couldn't really sound like him. This was a guy who took everything before him and put it together and in this amalgamation, for this character. And it was very hard to sound like him because he did too many things really well in different ways, from voices to flows to, how he was writing, how the song sounded, how he approached the song. You could only kind of sound like him voice wise, like Shine or, something like that, or sound like or imitate a flow of his, or the way his inflection on certain words and stuff like that. But he was also extremely influential. I mean, the whole thing about being just a tough guy who's also smooth and being like, I'm a vibe all to myself, no matter if you think I'm ugly or whatever like that. But, that's been talked about ad nauseum, if I'm using that term correctly. But anyway, like I said, you think Biggie had 2 albums. Maybe you think he had 3 or 4. He had at least 5. And if you're judging his legacy and you're trying to determine where we're going to put him and why, I think you should consider all of those albums I mentioned as quote unquote Biggie albums. So that would be Ready to Die, Life After Death, looking at that as 2 separate albums in a bunch of different ways. The Junior Mafia debut album and Lil Kim's album. And then really when you do a deep dive into the features and the guest appearances and the R&B joints even, you will find that you can put together another Biggie album or 2. So yeah, man, Rod doing Rod, thank you for joining me. I just want to say really thank you for joining me, because I looked at my followers at 20 followers, and that excited the hell out of me, because I don't know, for some reason, I know it's a really small number, but to get to that round number, like I released a video, I think last week, and it had 17 followers. I had 17 followers at the time. When I finished releasing the video, I had 20, and I was like, wow, 3 more people? That was like a sixth. That was like, 16-ish% of the amount of followers I had that I ended up gaining, in a day. And I just feel like, people, if you follow me, you really mess with me, and I'm just, you see what I'm doing here, right? It's just like a guy in his spare time, a teacher who kind of just talks about some randomness that I feel that's in my head. I do it because I need to get it out of my head. I don't do it because I want to be famous or anything like that. If I did, I'd have a much better setup, right? But I have some spare minutes when my kids are on a play date and stuff like this, and I do this, and it amazes me that anyone wants to listen and tells me, man, I liked what you did, and and even when people take the time to comment or share it and everything, and it's very easy to feel like no one wants to hear what you want to say. It's very easy to feel insecure. As much as people will tell you those good things, people will also tell you what you could be doing better. And, they'll send you a link to someone doing the same thing you're doing, but better, and they're kind of telling you, not in so many words, that, oh, well, if you were doing that thing better, this is what you'd be like. They'll tell you, oh, my friend, oh, they do this and they have so many followers and this and that. And there's a lot of things that make you feel like, especially if you're somebody who already is in their head a little bit, there's a lot of things that can make you feel like you aren't you're not someone people want to hear. But you have to then remember, only you have your perspective. Only you can do you and say the things you say and the way you say it, and that's really what you're here for. So not worrying about your setup and what things are not perfect and everything like that. It's just you just get out there and you do it. And the thought of having, because if 20 people are following, 120 people are watching. They may only watch for 120 seconds or 20 seconds, but I don't know, I just find it really dope. Even as a person who used to create content before we had this kind of stuff, at the very beginning of this stuff, and it was released music and sold music and stuff like that, I just think it's pretty dope that anybody rides with me doing this stuff. So yeah, I'm just gonna keep making more of these for regarding things that I'm thinking and things that I like. So yeah, Rod doing Rod, thank you for joining me. Peace.